You have a recording.
Yes, please, ma'am.
The divine lift. We have seen in the second chapter that just 2 days before the hero appeared on the scene, the master had begun to influence the boys directly to higher aspirations with constant hints and an occasional silent lecture on love. These stray explanations and lectures on divinity and spirituality that the master had conveyed so far since the year 1922 to his many disciples and visitors, if put together, would, I make bold to say, provide an unprecedented illumination on divine points, such as has never appeared in print or manuscript to this day. While the story of the deep effects that these discourses have had on many a stony heart would be another inspirational reading for those who aspire to spirituality. And as much as I like to repeat some of the discourses here, the question of space and the sequence of this narrative compel me to leave them for a separate work. Though I cannot help adding that it was only one of these that really saved me from the clutches of Maya and made me surrender myself to the master some 6 years ago. But the series of divine explanations that His Holiness was pleased to convey since the 23rd of November, 2 days after the advent of Ali, made all the young and old who had the good fortune to be present at the time to hold their breath with amazement. From that day, the separate sections of the spiritual instruction classes, such as the Gujarati, Marathi, Persian, and Urdu, were postponed for some time. For more than a month after this date, the master continued to convey for a couple of hours every evening these explanations. And all the boys, as well as the older disciples, were held spellbound with rapt attention and enthusiasm. And the wonder of it was that the master did this merely through gestures and alphabet pointing, maintaining his grim silence throughout. Besides, he conveyed the deep subject matter as he alone can convey, and in such a way that the little ones were no less interested and enthralled than the grown-up. Since then, these have been compiled and form a small booklet, which can well be styled Creation and Its Causes. It is all very novel, fantastic, and fairy tale-like. Yet it is the most logical explanation of divinity and the whole of the creation as far as the reach of the intellect allows, that has ever been brought to light in this way. The suns and the moons, the skies and the plains, the ethereal, mineral, vegetable, animal, and human kingdoms, births, deaths, heaven and hell, the subtle and the mental worlds, saints and prophets, and the very source of all, the soul of souls, are described, explained, and shown by the master as one would describe a city, explain the effects of wine, and show what is music after actually seeing, drinking, and hearing them all. He would explain and elucidate points so very clearly and logically as would carry the hearers almost to the verge of subjective experience. So far as this creation and its causes concerns this narrative, it was the master's inimitable tact in creating the moral of love out of all the various subjects at the end of the discourse every evening. Quotes, "Love me and you will find me. I am ready to make you Vivekanandas." And Ram Tirthas, Ali's, and Arjun's, the only prize asked for is love. Spirituality is offered as a loot. Love alone will get the lion's share. Divinity is being auctioned. Make the highest bid with all the love that you can create and command. End quotes. Such was the gist of the master's constant remarks that he kept on adding from time to time during and after this special spiritual class as the spiritual sauce to the great divine feast that was freely being served to the lucky ashramites. On the 28th of November 1927, in the course of such remarks, the master even went to the extent of disclosing a part of his internal game to the boys and conveyed through the usual signs. Quotes, "At first, I had intended to advance you gradually in the path, but the time of the great spiritual outburst that takes place in the world at long intervals is near at hand. And so I have changed the program. I am going to advance a few amongst you who will be ready with love very soon. It is not late yet. Let your hearts strive and strain to the utmost and create love and feelings for me." End quotes. But amidst all such suggestions, the boys were equally impressed upon not to strain their brains. They were frequently reminded that painful attempts would not avail in creating love, as free attempts made with joyous enthusiasm and boyish glee would.
Thanks, Rosalie. Gloria, please. Could you unmute and continue?
Besides firing their intellect with spirituality in this way, divinity was directly imparted to the boys by the master through frequent embraces and pats and fondling them for a number of times in a day. At times, the boys were pat till they fretted and fumed with love and feelings, and out of sheer ecstasy, even disobeyed the master when asked to go away or take to studies, save the hero, who even in the fever heat of love stuck to his watchword obedience and never defied the master through word or deed, as did some of the other boys amidst the sobs and throbs of their little hearts. Thus, within a fortnight, the atmosphere became surcharged with love in the Meher ashram. Many of the boys and some of the grown-ups members of the institution began also to look greatly changed. They became reserved and less talkative. They were frequently found preoccupied in the thoughts of the master and were found averse to eating, playing, and sleeping. Ali led this group prominently. To a casual observer, Ali still remained the same picture of innocent mischief and boyish activity, but when watched carefully, the great change in his heart was easily perceptible in many ways. Every now and then, the master's name was on his lips. His hands, too, worked with the vibrations of his heart and scribbled out his uppermost thoughts in words such as, quote, Meher Baba is my master, end quote. Aga Ali, the son of Meher Baba. Quote, this book belongs to the humble servant of Meher Baba, end quote, etc. On his books, papers, and all odd things that he came across with, and on which the music of his heart could be reproduced, whether through pencil, a pen, or a scratch with a piece of stone or metal. Besides, things that belonged to the master seemed to have a great attraction for the boy, and he could be often seen fondling and playing with the master's sandals, pillow, coat, etc. Unlike many of the other boys, Ali did not seem to be much attracted towards the master's photos or in playing with and adoring them. Was very keen in collecting the master's hair, nails, and even a piece of cotton wool. A piece of cotton wool that he may have once used to stuff his ears with. He will treasure this up as one would treasure diamonds and pearls and constantly feast his eyes on them. But the most remarkable point was the great attraction that Ali began to have for the master's personality. Just as the needle will rush at the magnet when brought near to it, Ali used to seek proximity of the master at the first opportunity and remain by him as long as he could. Still, for a casual observer, there was nothing like a show about him. It was, however, on the 17th of December that the depth of his feeling came to be known generally. Some days before this, he got eczema on his hand, and on this day, the master decided for Ali to remain in the hospital, aloof from everyday life till it was cured. And when he was removed there, tears began to roll down his cheeks in a string of sparkling pearls. Why? Simply because he could not bear the thought of separation from the master, even for a few days. He did not, however, allow this fact to escape from his lips voluntarily. It was only when the master argued with him for about an hour or so that the real reason of his crying came to light. His weeping did not cease until the master conveyed to him a solemn promise that he would not have to remain in the hospital for more than 2 days, and that during these 2 days, he, the master, would come to see him occasionally. Chapter 5, All Aflame. On the 20th December 1927, the 41st day of his fast, the master confined himself in a double room in the near vicinity of the Meher Ashram. This room was built on the spot as early as in the month of July of the same year, some 5 months in advance, and none could make any head or tail of it at that time. About 6 feet in length, equally deep on the ground, and 4 feet in breadth, with a small flight of stairs just sufficient for a single person to pass through this crypt-like place at a time. It was solidly built in lime and stone and resembled a steel safe. In place of a roof, a flat piece of wooden board was fixed over the top, closing the room in from all sides, save the small opening above for the stairs. Immediately above this peculiar pit of a room, another was built of wooden scantlings, bamboo mating, and iron sheets. This later room, was a bit more spacious than the crypt right below it. A door was fixed at one end of this upper room for the attendants and visitors who were but seldom let in. The room had three other openings as windows. One of these was at the back overlooking the Rija Sadga or Sadak ashram, a set of 5 separate rooms, each one just large enough for a person to lie down comfortably, wherein 5 of the grown-up disciples had also imprisoned themselves just a few days before the master confined himself. The wonderful phenomena witnessed by some of this later group during their voluntary imprisonment does not concern this narrative. That fact has simply been mentioned to give an idea of the wide scope of the master's internal workings. To continue the description of the master's prison, the remaining 2 windows were in the front overlooking the Meher Ashram, its playing grounds, and the rest of the premises connected with it. One of these was enclosed with wire netting for the master to look through when he retired into the upper room, and the other served the main purpose of enabling him to appear before the disciples, boys, and visitors, as he generally did throughout the day and also during the early hours of dawn. The master remained looked up here till the 26th of February, 1928. During the period of 2 months and 8 days, the master never came out of this peculiar lookup and usually retired for the night in the vault below. On the same day, the 20th of December, 1927, the master passed another extraordinary order. Quotes, all the boys in the institution must not even be touched with a hand by anyone, including the class teachers and the school and ashram authorities. End quote. All these were but the faint, gross indications of some powerful divine current having been let loose in the surroundings. Yet, none of the most enthusiastic of the disciples was ever prepared for the all-aflame result that followed quickly.
Thank you, Gloria. Ernie, please, unmute.
The fire of love that was smoldering silently of late in many of the tiny hearts, within a week of the master's self-imprisonment, began to give out sparks. Strings of pearl-like tears began to flow freely from many little eyes every now and then, without an apparent reason. This much was certain, that it was neither due to any physical pain or privations, nor was it due to any grief. Many of the boys, on the contrary, found relief and a kind of pleasure in weeping out their hearts. Meditation and concentration, weeping and crying, appealed to them more than eating, sleeping, and playing. They were tears of love. Who weeps for love, he weeps the best. Who cries for else, he does but just. It was this line couplet that the boys were rendering into reality and action. Even during the school recess for a few minutes, the boys could not help giving vent to the throbs of their hearts through soul-stirring sobs. And the school compound used to present a touching scene for a few minutes during this first week of the master's self-imprisonment. Everywhere the huddled up figures of the boys were found engrossed in meditation, or sobbing out the throbs of their little hearts all over the ground and in nooks and corners of the surrounding premises. That even this separation of a few hours from the master's proximity during the school periods was unbearable and painful to these boys was an open secret. But lo, the New Year day of the Christian era, the 1st of January, 1928, which also happened to be the 52nd day of the master's fasting and the 12th one since he confined himself, witnessed the most magnificent outburst of divinity that has perhaps ever manifested itself in the world in such a way, as if the deep-rooted divine emotion of the select few had set the rest of the boys into commotion. The majority of them began to cry openly every now and then throughout the day. But it was in the evening that the climax was reached. From the one to the last of every creed and caste, the boys in the ashram burst into tears and began to weep and wail as if all their dear ones were reported to be dead at a stroke. For about an hour, between 7 and 8 in the evening, this wonderful phenomenon simply held the onlookers spellbound. The shrieks and cries could even be heard a quarter of a mile away from the ashram. Attempts were, of course, made by the authorities in pacifying the boys and ascertaining from them the reason for this outburst, but it was all to no purpose. They seemed to be all engrossed in crying and deaf to all else. Baba, Baba, the name by which the master is generally known, were the only words that could be heard distinctly in all this tumult. Only this much was as clear as daylight, and that however wildly they might have been crying, when brought in the presence of the master, they became silent with a magical swiftness. The following day, during the 20 minutes of recess, a similar outburst was witnessed on the school grounds. But the wonder of it was that at the sound of the warning bell for resumption of classes, it all came to an abrupt end. Although the select few seemed still struggling for subjecting their hearts to the command of the master in the shape of the ringing bell. After a day or two more, such collective crying of the boys ceased, yet many still confined weeping now and then, yet many still continued weeping now and then for days together. But in all this inborn and locally affected crying, the weeping of Ali was the most singular. The throbs of his heart, though seemingly vibrating his very bones, brought out almost silent sobs. He never talked sentimentally or in lofty words. He neither desired spiritual advancement nor asked for divine enlightenment. The proximity of the master was all in all to give him peace and contentment. The happiness of his heart and the tranquility of his mind when he happened to be near the master was not a mystery even to a casual observer. At such moments, he used to look at the very picture. At such moments, he used to look the very picture of peace and calmness. From the second week of January, however, the master began to avoid close contact with Ali. This crack lover, as my friend Mr. Dada Chanji, one of the faithful disciples of the master, likes to call him in his notes and diaries, was kept at arm's length for some time. Perhaps he was sufficiently surcharged with love to the bursting point. Although the master avoided personal touch, he seemed bent upon keeping Ali's feelings strung to the last tune. The boy was often called to the master, only to be dismissed with a curt inquiry instead of an embrace or a loving pat that he so long used to get. The treatment of the master was a sort of fuel to the fire of love that was all aflame by now in his little heart. In spite of his characteristic suavity, Ali could not curb the twitches and twinges that flickered on his usually complacent features on such occasions. He suffered and bore all this bravely and patiently, as only a true lover can bear and suffer. For a heart that is not aglow with such deep divine emotions, it is simply impossible to imagine even 1/10 of the poignancy of the pain that was caused to this brave and bold lover through such deliberate separation and intentional pinpricks of the master. And for all that, Ali neither disobeyed the irritating commands of the master nor uttered an undignified word to his face, much though he fretted and fumed when he got away from him, as if to show to what extent this noble soul could go in controlling his emotion and obeying his commands. The master, on the evening of the 17th of January, in the presence of many other boys and disciples, sent for Ali nearly a dozen times, each time dismissing him on one pretext or the other, without letting him come within his loving clasp, for which the hero was as impatient as a fish out of water. The master himself could not help bursting into a silent eulogy of Ali that he conveyed through his usual gestures to those around him. The gist of it was, here is the concrete example of that noble sentiment. Masti me bisar apna sake ke kadam parho. That is, let my head remain on the feet of my master, even when I am in the overpowered state of love. Ali is in the overpowered state. Still, he is not indifferent in carrying out the commands in spite of the tumult in his heart. On the 28th of January, the master openly declared Ali to be quite ready with sufficient love to enable him to be taken away from the domain of the bound to the region of the free. But for a final touch from him, then why this touch was withheld? Well, here came in the devil, as mentioned on the opening page of this book, and formed quite a story by itself, which will be duly narrated in a separate chapter. In the meantime, let me tell my reader as to how and why the master, pending this final touch, which has been withheld to this date, gave Ali a glimpse of that, which is beyond the gross.
Thanks, Ern. Marvin, please.
Chapter 6, Beyond the Gross. What a coincidence. Just 24 hours after the master made the memorable declaration about Ali's readiness, it was also proved to the hilt in a very tangible way. The day following the one described in the foregoing chapter, that is the 29th of January, in the evening at about 6:30, as usual of late, the master began to impart some pinpricks to Ali. In the presence of many of the boys and disciples, Ali was taunted with remarks such as, "He is very keen about his studies these days and has no thoughts for me, and is always thinking about his father." The effect was soon evident. It was the first time that Ali lost control over his heart. Much as he tried, he could not help sobbing out loudly amidst profuse tears that were rapidly rolling down his cheeks. And at this display, which was very unlike him, the boy was so very exasperated that with a jump, he got up, he got away from the master's seat and began to run at random as fast as his legs could carry him. Mr. Afsari, who happened to be standing nearby amongst the disciples, was signed by the master to follow him, and he soon overtook the boy. Afsari, with his excellent command over the Persian language and an inborn sympathy for those loving souls, generally always succeeded in restoring the composure of Ali and the likes. But this time, for all his attempts and persuasions, he failed to pacify Ali, and therefore he had to take the boy again to the master, who was, as usual, seated by the window inside the upper room. But the proximity of the master made the hero go more wild with his sobbing and crying, which had by now become terrible to look at. The sobs were heart-rending, and Ali's whole frame shook, as if vibrating with a high-voltage electric current, while tears rolled down from his eyes in an unbreakable chain. After some time, the master signed to Mr. Afsari to bring the boy inside. By this time, Ali was almost unconscious, and so the gentleman had actually to lift him up while conducting him inside. Scrupulously avoiding a touch of his person, the master, however, allowed Ali to be brought very close to him and began to convey some pacifying words. It was nearly 9:30 at night. This piquant drama had continued for nearly 3 hours, and for all the master's remonstrations, Ali seemed beyond the capability of controlling his soul-stirring sobs. On the contrary, the situation was growing more acute every minute. The onlookers were turned into statues, speechless and breathless with wonder at the sight, especially when the boy seemed breathing his last amidst those terrible sobs. At this, the master left arguing with intellect to intellect and seemed forced to take recourse to the language of the heart. And did anybody hear it? No. Many saw it. It was a pat, an embrace, and a kiss. Let me tell you exactly how. The master gathered Ali up in his arms, patted his head, imprinted a silent kiss on his forehead, and then placed his head on the boy's heaving bosom for 2 or 3 minutes and finished. Ali became as calm as a mill pond. No sound, no vibrations, no movements. He seemed to be sound asleep. Not the slightest trace of the terrible storm remained visible on his features. For about 15 to 20 minutes, he was left undisturbed in this divine coma. Then the master beckoned to Afsari to wake him up. But here was another surprise for the onlookers. Ali would not open his eyes, and when his eyelids were pulled up, the iris was found turned inward. He was looking beyond the gross. Under the master's instructions, several questions were then repeatedly put to him, but no reply was received. However, after some time to the question, "How are you, Aga Ali?" there came a reply, "Kush, happy," in a very feeble voice, which seemed to come from a great distance. The following 2 questions were similarly replied by him. "What do you see?" "Baba." "Where?" "Everywhere." To see everywhere that which is everywhere is happiness indeed, and worth 1,000 deaths. But alas, Even 1,000 deaths are not sufficient to gain this sight. In the course of a discussion the writer once had with a Hindu divine, the latter, when told, "What tedious expectation! One has to wait for years and years to gather the fruit." He blurted out, "My dear sir, years? If you are offered perfect sight at the end of 10,000 years, take it. Strike the bargain. It is very cheap." But for one, to use Dr. Reynold A. Nicholson's words, not only journeys to God, but for one, not only journeys to God, that is, passes from plurality to unity, but in and with God, that is, continuing in the unitive state, he returns with God to the phenomenal world. End quote. Like my master, to give such a sight is a question of a touch and a glance of grace. I don't mean that Ali got the perfect sight that day. Rather, it was a mere glimpse of that which is beyond the gross. But all the same, it was a genuine sight. To go into the details of the degrees of internal sight is not within the compass of this little book. Suffice it to say that Ali one day will get as perfect a sight as gained by his more fortunate co-ashramat, Abdullah, the Chota Baba, during this very month of January 1928, when he received the, quote, final touch, end quote, from the master, which no power on earth could withhold at the right moment. Maya, with all its devilish paraphernalia of war, will be helpless in the end, although it has, for the time being, succeeded in separating the moth from the flame. Now to revert to the sequence. At the last reply of the boy, everywhere, the master quickly signed for his removal. He was taken into the hospital and given some suitable treatment for the physical exhaustion and shock that he had incidentally been subjected to, and made comfortable on one of the beds there. One of the disciples was instructed to remain awake by the hero's side for the rest of the night and report his condition. The master himself did not retire to the lower chamber till 2 o'clock that night, and continued inquiring, for the boy stayed every now and then during those 4 hours. In the course of a remark, His Holiness was pleased to convey, quote, "Much as I like to leave him alone for some time, his terrible sobs forced me to give him the sight, for that which he would have dropped his body. But for
Thanks.
that, he would have dropped his body."
Thanks, Marv. Mahu, please.
The next 3 days, Ali was detained in the hospital and kept under strict nursing. He looked well and moved about freely since the very next morning, but seemed dazed and dumbfounded, and there was a vacant look in his eyes, while he did not take food for, this is not even Ali, this is Abdullah Parkravan.
That's this is Chota Baba, correct?
Yeah, Abdullah Parkravan, yeah, Chota Baba is what name Baba gave him. He did not take food for, oh, he got to the 6th plane of consciousness. Yeah, Chota Baba, Hazrat Abdullah, called him Hazrat. Okay. While he did not take food the first 24 hours. On the 3rd day, the 1st of February, a marked change came about Ali. In place of lethargy, keen activity was seen in his movements. Often he was seen running here and there all over the ashram ground, as if in chase of something that was receding away from him, and looked very disturbed and ruffled. To a casual observer, the boy looked stark mad. In spite of it all, how very considerate was he about the master will be seen from the following episode. For the first time, the secular education of the boys had been neglected for some days during the upheaval of love. But on this day, the 1st of February, the master desired all the boys to once again begin attending the school strictly according to the fixed timetables. Many boys at first persisted in being let alone, and some had substantial grounds to do so, considering their disturbed intellect and throbbing hearts, but all gave in after more or less of persuasion. Of all, Ali had the greatest right to be exempted, since when he could not think of eating and playing or remaining at ease, even for an hour or so, at one fixed place, how could he even think of attending the school? Perhaps he would not have been called upon to do so without even requesting for an exemption, but what a noble soul. Just because the master would be pleased, Ali himself appeared before him and of his own accord offered to go to school. Only those who have a proper idea as to an ache in the heart and a stir in the soul would, to a certain extent, understand the significance of this sacrificial offering. Perhaps it was this noble and spontaneous offer that made the master's task very easy in persuading the other boys. Page 30. Now, although Ali went to school, the extraordinary condition of his heart continued to be the same, and a special watch was kept on him throughout the 24 hours. Of all his normal tendencies, eating was the one to which the boy became very averse. He did not avoid food, but he simply could not take it. So much so that on the 2nd of February, the master had to feed him with his own hands, with some rice and milk. However, on the following night, Ali began to sleep well, and the more he slept, the more conscious he became. By the 4th of February, Ali was almost his old self again. The sight, the capital sight, having been cut off by the master. But the disappearance of the glimpse of the beyond brought about a violent change in Ali. The uppermost thought in him now seemed to be to run away somewhere, perhaps in search of the lost treasure, just as he had been running after the receding sight recently. Once he actually managed to run away a mile to the surrounding fields and hills, but because of the special watch kept on him, he was brought back. His uneasiness on this score grew so keen that the master restored to him the sight once again on the 9th of February, simply by passing his fingers on the boy's forehead. However, the following week, Ali continued remaining very turbulent, and truculent. The sight was perhaps being flickered by the master before being completely withdrawn, pending the final touch. But his love for the master seemed to be greatly intensified. Even while asleep, he was often heard repeating Baba, Baba, and once was actually found in a devotional pose, lying on his back with both hands clasped in a characteristic salute. He looked as if paying homage to the king of his heart, although he was sleeping soundly at that time. It was remembered that Ali frequently used to amuse himself with the master's odd things, including a pair of sandals patched at 101 places. However, to the horror of the onlookers, the boy, in a fit of feelings, one day that week suddenly grabbed at and snatched away a fairly big piece of the leather strap from the sandal and began to chew it down frantically. Before he could be stopped by anyone, the piece was actually gulped down by him. Now, before turning the other side of the shield in the next chapter, I may be excused for making a few comments on that which has already been written in the foregoing lines, besides narrating a little story as a sidelight. One should not run away with the idea that merely through constant thinking and hearing about love, this attribute was created in Ali, or that Ali was the only recipient of the master's grace in this connection. For a million times, we may repeat the word love. This is capital love, but it would remain a painted rose on paper. The fragrance of a rose will alone be found in the rose itself, and similarly, love will remain a sealed book to us until actually realized.
Thanks, Mahu. Rolf, are you there? Do you want to read? Unmute first. How about you, VJ? Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Very good.
I can. Jai Baba.
I'm here now.
Okay,
Go
I'll
ahead,
catch you.
DJ, but I finally got it.
Well, go ahead, Rolf. While we got you. Hang on, VJ, just because
Honey?
Well, VJ was ready to begin. He had the words were rolling off his tongue, and I sort of interrupted.
Okay.
I was just trying to get the phone to. It's better if VJ reads if he's okay with him. Yeah.
Okay. VJ, shoot.
I'm not quite ready. Sorry.
Then, although Ali's characteristics clearly show him as a rational and non-sentimental boy, and not one who would be easily led away by empty suggestions, there are a few more boys in the institution who would each make, if not so long, an equally soul-stirring story of their great heart struggles as a direct result of the Master's grace. Still, perhaps some would say this all about irresponsible and impulsive boys in their early, pardon me, sobs and throbs, yeah, teens. But I have already made some passing remark about the grown-up disciples having actually experienced eternal power. And as a further example, I cannot help mentioning the name of one of them, my worthy brother-in-law, brother in faith, Mr. K.J. Dastur, MA LLB, the author of Success in Life, and His Divine Majesty, Meher Baba, and the Meher Ashram Institute, the principal of the Hazrat Babajan High School, a man of letters and a journalist of no small merit. I have had the pleasure of his acquaintance since the very first day that he came to see the master in the month of June 1927. True, from the very outset, he proved himself for literary talents and
VJ,
logical. Yeah,
VJ, your audio is disappearing. I guess it's the internet connection.
yeah, it is.
We're losing you, so we'll have to change readers. I'm sorry. Yeah. Rolf, are you still with us?
I think so. I thought that was my problem rather than VJ's, but we'll try it and see how it goes. VJ, you left off.
Go from the top, okay? Because it started breaking up here.
But I have already made some passing remark about grown-up disciples having actually experienced the master's internal power too. And as a further example, I cannot help mentioning the name of one of them, my worthy brother in faith, Mr. K.J. Dastur, M.A. LLB, the author of Success in Life, and His Divine Majesty, Meher Baba, and the Meher Ashram Institute. The principal of the Hazrat Babajan High School, a man of letters and a journalist of no small merit. I have had the pleasure of his acquaintance since the very first day that he came to see the master in the month of June 1927. True, from the very outset, he seemed drawn toward the master and believed him as God realized. He proved himself humble for all his literary talents, rationality, and logical expositions. Yet he looked every inch an MA LLB, that he was in all his actions, words, and mode of life. And this continued for some months until the season of love began at Mehrabad in the month of December 1927. But what a transformation it brought about in Mr. Dastur within the 2 following months. It will be best narrated by the fortunate gentleman himself some day. Suffice it to say that the Master of Arts and Bachelor of Laws became the real slave of the Master of Divinity, and for some days knew no law other than the law of love. He became indifferent to all external embellishments. Sandals took the place of socks and stylish boots on his feet, and at times these sandals were also given up, while the smart creased trousers became baggy and loose, and the head lost the pith hat, as well as his smart gait that was no longer there. At times, he reeled and rolled while walking, as if drunk to the last drop. Wherever he sat, it was a huddled figure with the head buried over his throbbing heart. Sleep and food had lost their irresistible craving for him for days together. Instead of his usual pithy conversation, he became silent to a degree and was heard chanting, even at odd hours, sometimes in the praise of the Master, as a devout Hindu sings the bhajan. The most spectacular change witnessed about him was when once or twice he went into a fit and simply rolled in dust on the bare, uneven ground, and scarcely any regard for injury to his person and clothes. But this is all about the external change that came about in him. To describe his internal experience fully is the word of a full chapter. However, I would say this much, that he saw with his open eyes in broad daylight that which even yogas yearn to have a glimpse of, with their eyes shut in deep meditation, besides experiencing the thrills and throbs of love internally. I have never loved anybody in my life and was quite free from the attribute until the Master played havoc with my heart. To say I love him is not enough. Oh, let me wash those loving feet with the blood of my heart. And so on is but the gist of Mr. Dastur's remarks that he had been conveying off and on since being imbibed with the divine spark from the Master. How are we doing? Oh, I'll go to the end. Long since, Mr. Dastur has regained his natural composure, but his intellectual attainments are nonetheless poorer for his heartache. On the contrary, the divine throbs of his heart that continue to this date help him a great deal in his penmanship, which will one day surely thrill the literary world. As instead of believing the master to be God realized, he has begun experiencing him as such. He now leads a perfectly normal life, pure and simple. Wow. Did we ever meet that man? Was he alive? Any